Hello again and welcome to another Imperial Guard Tactics video. Now today's video is a follow-up on one that I did a month or so ago regarding 3-line deployment. And a few people said, Mordian Glory, please could you give us a visual demonstration of what 3-line deployment looks like to give us an idea. And I was thought, you know what, that's a really good idea. So that's what I'm going to do today, guys. Now, essentially, just for those of you that may have missed the last video, I'm sure you all watch all my videos. I'm joking. For those that missed the last video, essentially I pointed out that one of the biggest mistakes that Imperial Guard commanders make, new Imperial Guard commanders make, is they don't have a 3-wave, 3-line deployment. What most people do is they have a thin, I suppose guard is green, a thin green line, whatever colour your army might be, and there tends to be not enough screening, and there tends to be not enough stuff that's pushing forward. And so, you know, often what you'll see is an Imperial Guard commander take 40 or 50 infantry, and he'll think that's enough to push forward and take objectives. And what happens is those 40 or 50 infantry get brushed aside, to be honest, in a turn. And then what that guard commander's left with is a lot of fire support, but not a lot of offensive capability. And you might think, well, surely fire support is offensive, you know, it's damage. Well, in 9th edition, damage is not as important as pushing forward. And so that is why you see a lot of Imperial Guard armies struggling, because their commanders have got away with, for many editions, with 50 or 60 infantry, and they think that's enough. But unfortunately, it's very easy for that amount of infantry to be swept aside, and for the guard commander to be left with a considerable amount of firepower, but not a significant way of pushing forward and taking ground. So today, I'm going to show you my preferred way of actually running my Imperial Guard, which is a bit controversial, and to sort of demonstrate the 3-line deployment and 3-line sort of attack plan. Now, first thing to mention is I am running this as my pure infantry Mordian Iron Guard list, the Mordian 50th Rifles. Now, some of you will not be running a pure infantry list, and that's absolutely fine. I'll go through as I'm explaining the video. I'll go through what you would do if you didn't have a pure infantry list. So don't worry about that. I just would say though that this pure infantry army, the reason why it's sort of the last bastion for the Guard in 9th edition, even with the reduction of things like chimeras and sentinels and whatnot, and the way that they've changed from the secondaries, is because, again, this kind of playstyle forces you to play the 9th edition game, essentially. Okay? Right, so let's go through some of the units that I've got here. Now, as you can see, this looks like a big just mess of infantry. Right? And I get that. This looks like just, what the hell's going on here? There's a huge amount going on. Well, what I'll do is I'll go through and explain what I would call a first line unit. Your first line unit is going to be something like what you see here. 10-man infantry squad, you know, heavy weapon, totally optional, close range special weapon, maybe a power sword. Point is that it's your first line of infantry. And you can see here that there is a distinct line all the way across of infantry squads. Almost an unbroken line. Okay? That is your first line. It sounds obvious, right? But that is an almost unbroken line of infantry. Their job is very simply, guys, to move forward and take the objectives. Now, I've mapped out a typical 9th edition board here. So we've got 4 objectives, one there, one in the compound, one in the craters, and one in the enemy deployment zone. Okay, must be facing some Gene Stealer cult today, guys. We can't find the enemy. So the objective of the first line squads is very simple. It is to push forward and to take ground. And that's why often I include in my infantry squads, and when I'm taking, you know, my 18 infantry squads, which I typically do, I tend to have quite a lot of them which don't have any heavy weapons, because their job is to push forward and take ground and to lasgun as many enemies to death as possible. Okay, so that's my first line. Now my second line, you'll notice, is a bit of a mix. You'll see there's some heavy weapon teams within the infantry squads of the second line. There's whilst I tend to distribute my heavy weapons equally, you'll tend to find that the second line has a few more of them. And the reason for this being is very simple. Whilst they will still be pushing forward, because the second line must also push forward, the second line of infantry is more likely to be out of range with a lot of its initial starting guns, like las guns and plasma guns or flamers or grenade launchers. So you want to have a line of infantry which is still able to move forward and put out some damage. You also might find that you're in a more defensive situation. Okay, typically you'll be fighting over the middle of the board, but you may find yourself in a more defensive situation, and in that case you'll want a bit more long-range firepower. Now, a mistake that some people make is they think that the first and second line have two different roles, and the first line's role is to push forward and the second line's role is to sit back and shoot. That is fundamentally incorrect. If you do that, what you will find, very simply guys, is that your first line, they're already dead men walking. Expect to lose 90 to 100% of the first line of infantry. Okay? Or first line of units. You might be using hellhounds. Where you see, as I was saying, if you're not running pure infantry, where you see flamer squads and melter squads, instead perhaps insert sentinels or hellhounds or chimeras with dual heavy flamer, which are very, very popular at the moment. Okay, but nonetheless, whatever your frontline units may consist of, your first line, be it melter and flamer infantry squads like me or chimeras and hellhounds like yourself, you'll still want some infantry on that front line, by the way. Expect 90 to 100% of the units in that line to die. Okay, now if they're going to die, what that means is if they're the only units in your army pushing forward, it means that by sort of turn 2, turn 3, when they're all dead, you no longer have any board control in the centre of the battlefield, which is bad, because as I always say guys, look at this battlefield. There's one objective in our deployment zone, there's one objective in the enemy deployment zone, but actually 50% of the objectives, and this is typical in most games of 9th edition, typical that 50% of the objectives will be in the middle of the board, and you will need to secure and control that mid board in order to win the game. Alright? So your first line is going to have to push forward. They're going to have to push forward fast. They're going to have to get into the enemy's face. There's two ways of doing this. One, you advance forward like this. There's a slow way, slow and methodical, and there's fast and distraction counter effects, essentially. Slow and methodical would be where you move these guys forward 6 inches a turn and you don't plan on reaching the middle of the board until turn 2. Okay, you've got 12-inch movement and you move forward turn 2, and you'll be in range of most of the objectives then, because you're 12 inches from the centre of the board with this deployment zone that we're looking at, and typically with most of the deployment zones you're 12 inches range from your deployment zone to 10 to 12 inches from your deployment zone to a middle board objective. Okay, so you could do this with the 4 pillars. We're using Frontline Warfare as an example mission, but you could do this with 4 pillars, and you could do this with any of the Strike Force missions. You'll tend to find that you're 10 to 12 inches away from many of the contested objectives. So your first line, you can either, like I said, you can move forward 6 inches and then fire and do some damage, and then turn 2 you'll move on to the objectives, but you won't start getting those big primary points until turn 3, turn 4, turn 5. Now that might sound a bit precarious, but what I find with the way that with that method of fighting and that method of using your first and second line is that you will lose at the beginning of the game, but you'll claw it back in the second half of the game. Or you can burn bright, burn fast, and be gone. Not necessarily bad, but be gone. Where you actually spend the first turn moving, and you move your whole first wave of infantry forward 12 inches or more, and you make sure that turn 1 you have got infantry all along this centre line, and that will mean that you will control that and you'll be denying the enemy points, and then your second wave will only move up 6 inches, and they will, Or you can move the second wave as well, and you won't do any damage in your turn 1, or you'll do very little. What you will do is you'll have board control, and then you dig in, and turn 2 onwards you dig in. The advantage of that is obviously you take board control early on, you start denying the enemy points early on. The disadvantage is you will put yourself very quickly in a position to receive a serious enemy counterattack. If you're facing a close range shooty army or a combat army, by pushing everyone forward like that, what you'll find is you're opening yourself, if you've gone turn 1, you're opening yourself up to a absolutely vicious riposte. So you have to be careful. Now, we won't get into that just now, but and I will be doing a follow-up video this week on when to use each one of those tactics. But just to be aware is when you're using your first and second line, there is 2 ways of moving them up. Anyway, let's get back to the deployment. So, like I said, your first line and second line will actually be doing the same thing. And they will be spending the whole game pushing forward, taking objectives, and winning you primary points. That's their job. And obviously secondary points depending on what you've picked. Now, the vast majority of your army will be taken up in first and second line units. These are not 3 equal lines. In fact, you'll probably find that 80% of your army, so about 1500 to 1600 points, will be taken up with first and second line units. Third line units are things like your heavy weapon squads. Okay? But also infantry squads which have been relegated to home objective securing. You see, you're always going to have an objective in your deployment zone. You're always going to need someone who can hold that objective. This means that when you're pushing forward, you still want to make sure that you have at least 2 to 3 combat units that are in range of the home objective. Now, in my case, what I would be doing with this army is I would have this infantry unit securing that objective, this infantry unit here with the officers helping to secure that objective, and then these third line mortars. So whilst it looks like, oh, these guys are part of the second line, actually the reality is they're part of the third line. And that brings me on to the last point that I want to make. Don't get overly hung up on the lines being perfectly neat and distinct. Even I, a Mordian Iron Guard commander, appreciates that. Look, at the end of the day, guys, you've got to be a bit tactically flexible. You've got to be able to adapt on the fly. You've got to be able to take into account that sometimes the terrain isn't going to line up perfectly for you to form your 3 beautiful lines of infantry. Okay, so you will find that the lines merge. I mean, look, this squad is literally merging over 2, lines. Okay, so that's why I've sort of been focusing on this central bit, because this actually here is a whole mess of first and second line merging. These guys here have got a lads cannon in cover. They may not move forward. They may not need to. They may stay there and provide fire support. I mean, if we look at this, if I was to play this game out now, what I would do, very simply, guys, is all the infantry outside of this barricade here. So you've got 2 infantry squads on the flank, 3 infantry squads here, and a bunch of officers. That's 50 infantry. They're going to move forward turn 1 to take that objective. This fire support squad and this fire support squad, you know what? Even though this unit is technically in the first line, in the front rank, they're probably going to be a third line unit because they're going to be staying back and providing fire support. Likewise here, I mean, we've got 1, 2, 3 units of infantry, maybe 4, that are going to, and the mortars that we're going to want to hold our home objective. And then over here, outside, we've got a big old mass of infantry. Maybe, like I said, maybe this squad here will actually push forward and will hold with this squad here. You just don't know. The thing is, you've got to be tactically flexible. All right. Now, this is a really interesting example because it's a perfect sort of shot of how the terrain can sometimes interfere with the best laid plans, and you've just got to throw your infantry down. These autocannons, they're definitely a third line unit. They're not moving forward. They're going to sat there and pound away with the big pom-pom cannons. But they're at the front because the first thing you want to do when you're looking at your deployment is to be like, where can I deploy my fire support units? That's what I do first. The first units that I throw down are my fire supports, and then I throw the infantry down afterwards. because you want to make sure your fire support units have got the best position. Now, if I'm running Wilderness Survivors, but that's not going to be around forever, guys. If I'm running Wilderness Survivors, then cover isn't as important for giving me survivability. It's still very important to give me an elevated position, to let me try and look down and get better lines of sight on the enemy. So, and if you're not running Wilderness Survivors, and so you don't always count as in cover, you definitely want to put those fire support units in cover. So if you look over here, on the front line, we've got, 3 squads, at least, 2 squads in this building, and these autocannons, which are probably, actually going to sit there for a lot of the game and hold back. But they'll move forward, these infantry squads will move forward if needed. But then you've got, 2 squads on the flank, and you've got, 4 squads here. And actually it turns out that whilst it looks like there's a lot of static fire support here, we're going to be pushing forward with 70 infantry to take that objective. And that's kind of how you want to be thinking. So first things that you deploy your fire support units, then throw your infantry down in between them. Last thing to mention, officers, they're kind of a third line unit, but they're sort of more of a second line. They're going to be pushing forward with the infantry, but you've got to keep them protected. I tend to deploy my officers in sort of command groups, with the commissars, a senior officer, and a priest, if you're taking priests, all together. And you can see I've done that again here. And then what I often tend to do is use my junior officers like as lone wolves. So this junior officer here is going to pretty much sit there and tell these mortars to take aim every single turn. Okay. I've also got, you guys know I love to do this, a junior officer leading my reserves, and he's going to be coming in and leading the reserve. So my junior officers sometimes will be acting as lone wolves, and sometimes, like over here, you can see I've got 2 officers and the commissar and the priest. Sometimes they'll be part of the main command group. So whilst I don't take command squads as in the unit, I tend to form my characters into command groups. 2 reasons to that: helps them stay, survivable behind lots and lots of ranks of infantry. And the second reason is because what you can find is if your opponent hasn't taken assassinate against you, which is good, you'll find that 3 guard infantry characters, especially like a priest and a couple of a commodore, commissar of the power sword, and officer of the power sword, you'll find they actually make effective bullying units, because between them you've got 8 power sword attacks there, and then you've got like the 5 chainsaw attacks from the priest, and he's got like full rerolls to hit. So, and the Lord Commissar hits on 2s. So they are actually quite an effective close combat bullying unit. So just bear that in mind. Now, I mentioned reserves before. Okay, you may find that you don't want to shove everything down on the board, and there's 2 reasons for that. One, in 9th edition you'll tend to find there's a bit of a traffic jam situation when I've got units here which are piling up behind each other and whatnot. There's a lot of terrain. Okay, and you also may find there's a lot of line of sight blocking terrain. I mean, if you look at this big building here, that is certainly going to make it difficult for my heavy bolters and las cannons to target the enemy. I mean, that's why you've always got to bring at least 2 squads of mortars, guys. I mean, I would probably recommend 3, but at least 9 mortars, however you want to bring them. But you may find there is some line of sight blocking terrain that is going to either it's going to restrict your lanes of fire, or that there is terrain in your deployment zone that causes a bit of a traffic jam. That's why it's always important to remember that reserves are still an important part, and you can take advantage of them. Now, I tend to use a couple of squads of veterans led by a junior officer for my reserves. That's a sort of narrative and personal choice. Scions would probably be point for point more efficient than that, although they would require a separate detachment. So it's, do you want command points, or do you want to be a slightly more army point efficient? But yes, they would definitely be counted as a first and second line unit. They're going to be pushing forward. They're going to be coming on from the flanks and helping to secure objectives. Now, there's 2 ways of using your reserves in the first and second line sort of method. First is you'll bring them in on a flank. You'll bring them in on a flank, and they will help you take an objective. Nice and simple, understood. However, it's important to remember that you'll be pushing forward with a lot of infantry. The enemy will be pushing forward to take the middle of the board. That's not always possible. So do not be afraid to bring in your reserves in your own table edge, especially if there's something like veterans with disciplined shooters, so they've got an 18-inch rapid fire and 3 plasma guns, because they will be able to come in and they'll still be able to rapid fire more than likely to whoever's on that middle objective, and they'll then follow up as almost a 2.5 line, or maybe they'll become third line units, helping to secure your home objectives whilst putting out plasma death onto the enemy. So don't be afraid of that. You know, if you're the kind of guy that likes on a Baneblade, there's no need necessarily for you to run that Baneblade on the flank. You can just bring it on as strategic reserves in your own deployment zone and secure your own objective with it. And it becomes a third line unit, but it was off the board because you were protecting it. That's what I do with my veterans. There's 2 examples of me winning games with my veterans. One as a first line unit and one as a third line unit. Both of them were against Dark Elder, and one of them is actually should be the battle report that is sticky to the main page of the channel. So there you go, guys. I hope that makes sense. So first and second line units are pretty much carrying out the same function. They'll be cramming near the front of the deployment zone, and they'll be pushing on to objectives. You'll tend to have less heavy weapons in the first line because they're to be honest, they're going to die, but also they're going to be definitely pushing forward turn 1. Your other support, your second line units, they're more than likely going to be pushing forward turn 1. So I would recommend you give them heavy weapons such as heavy bolters or autocannons, and then your third line units are ones that are typically going to be standing still for the whole game. When you want to give them las cannons and grenade launchers and plasma guns and missile launchers and mortars. Officers should be dispersed as command groups within the infantry horde, and reserves should be used to either take an objective that you're doing well on, or if you're traffic jammed or blocked in, or if you need to start securing your home objective, they can be brought in as a third line fire support unit that you are keeping safe. Hope this all makes sense, guys. Hope you have enjoyed this video. If there's any other videos that you'd like me to do a more practical demonstration on, like I have done here, please let me know down in the comments below. And just to reiterate it one last time, please don't get yourself all worried or het up if you're finding that your lines are getting intermingled and intermixed. That's absolutely fine. It's more of a concept than an actual 3 lines of infantry. Okay, so you see these are a third line unit, but they're at the front. That's because they're just going to be doing their fire support thing. They'll push forward if the first and second line starts faltering. Okay, hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and of course I'll see you guys next time.